Of course, George Washington was a pioneer down in Lewis County, and George Bush was up here, and a lot of people try to mush them together as one person.
Hello everyone, welcome back. If you haven't already, please check out part 1 of this series. It'll be linked somewhere, probably up here. But to recap real quick, last fall I was out in the Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia area to do some research and make some films about the Cowlitz Trail, work with some local museums, and to film what I thought was going to be a quick little film about George Washington Bush. When I was out west, it was revealed to me that all my research was incorrect. Next we meet Dr. Jewel Dunn, a genealogist at the Washington State Archives in Olympia. Jewel has spent the better part of a quarter century studying George Bush and lecturing on this exact topic.
There is no record that George Bush made himself that ever had a W in his name.
George Washington Bush never existed. Turns out the legacies of 3 people, George Washington of Centralia and George and Isabella Bush of Tumwater, had their legacies intertwined over the years. And we'll get into later on how exactly all of that happened.
He was very helpful with people, getting them started in giving him stores like flour, different type of stores like that for people that fell on hard times. One thing too is how much Isabella probably supported him and how little recognition. People want to recognize him for the half that's the African American, but they don't recognize her for the fortitude and the guts that she had to support him. I think that they were probably a couple hundred years ahead of their time to be in an interracial marriage at a time when slavery was still in place, and to raise 6 sons, to trek clear across the United States practically to come. It seemed like everything was against them.
George Bush, a person of color who, along with his wife Isabella, helped settle what is now Tumwater, Washington, was so kind and generous to their community that their peers petitioned Congress in DC so that George could own land.
It was a lot simple for them to go to the land office, say, hey, I want to get this 320 or 640 acres, and all they had to do was get approved. George Bush had to have a lot of people lift him up to get this done. I think that there was over 100 people that signed the memorial for him to be able to get this through. A House Bill 707, which was a private land claim.
Just to clarify, George Washington Bush is not a real person. That name is a combination of George Washington of Centralia and George Bush of Tumwater.
As a matter of fact, in 1855, George Bush took 6 articles out in the Pioneer Democrat newspaper and referred to himself as George Bush and wanted to make sure that his wife would receive his property should something happen to him.
George Washington saves his city during the economic recession, economic panic of 1893. George Washington was born the son of a slave and was quickly sold to a family in Missouri by his mother. Yeah. While with his adopted family in Missouri, George taught himself to read and became a skilled rifleman. Due to rising racial tensions in Missouri in 1850 after the Missouri Compromise, George and his family decided to move out west and settled near what is now Centralia in 1852. George Bush had already been in Tumwater for 8 years at that point, just to put it in perspective. Centralia becomes incorporated in 1886, and in 1893 there is a huge economic recession in the country, the worst it sees until the Great Depression. And so George Washington decides to help the struggling citizens of his community. And he keeps them afloat by creating charity programs and food pantries, things like this, and also taking over people's mortgages when they couldn't afford to pay so the banks don't take their homes back. And George sits on these mortgages until people are able to get back on their feet financially and deeds the homes back to them. So this helps Centralia, weather the storm until the next gold rush of 1898 in the area. Where did the W come from? How did their stories get intertwined? Because during George Bush's life, he never used a middle initial, and appears he doesn't even have a middle name.
If you look at his headstone that's down in Tumwater, that's the original headstone. And I did kind of a little study of all the records, and I could not find anything prior to 1900 that had the middle name.
George Bush doesn't have a middle name. He never used a middle initial or anything in his life, on documents, newspapers, anything that was, documented. Even after his passing, the W wasn't used.
There was a gentleman that came out west in the party with the Kindreds and the Simmons and George Bush and several bachelors. His name was John Minto. And in around 1900, there was an article written about reminiscence of traveling from Missouri to Oregon. And I found a typewritten copy of this reminiscence in his papers that are at the Oregon Historical Society. And that is the first time that there is a W put into his name.
So yes, the first time it appears, according to Jewel, is in the Oregon Historical Quarterly.
There is no record that George Bush made himself that ever had a W in his name. It's this reminiscence that John Minto had done, because he was in his late 70s, early 80s when he had told the story, and there's going to be embellishment or things that aren't going to be remembered 60 years after the fact.
And because of that easy mistake, confusing their names in an academic source, it was assumed correct.
And I don't think that he was the typist. He would have been in his late 70s, early 80s. So it was a typewriter of the time. And I think it was somebody else that did the typeset.
Typewriter in this context is the person doing the lettering and the typeset in the actual press, not the, machine used for creating Word documents. That was around at the time, but not super prevalent. Thing is, these mistakes happen. I made a similar one in the first part of this series, where I mistakenly added O'Brien to Isabella's maiden name. He married Isabella James O'Brien in Missouri in 1830. It's James. Her maiden name was Isabella James. But for whatever reason, the name O'Brien got teleported into my head, and I said it, and it made it all the way to the post. That's one of our jobs as historians, is asking, why is this the way it is? Is this correct? You're looking for these inconsistencies and these patterns and trying to understand how we got from A to B in understanding the text and context of the situation.
Researching George Bush have gone back to Minto's writings and see, there it is. There is, in his own words, pioneer who knew George Bush, and he says George W. Bush. That must be right.
We have just scratched the surface of the legacy of George Bush of Tumwater and George Washington of Centralia. How are they able to afford these journeys out west? How are they able to afford buying people's properties back? What's the real reason why they left Missouri? How well did George know Jim Bridger? What's the importance of this bowl? If you'd like for me to continue this series, find out what I can here in St. Joe and in Kansas City in the area, let me know in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. See you all next time.